What if the man who was supposed to be your happily ever after was the one who sold you into slavery? Welcome back, everyone. Today, we are diving into the heart-wrenching and high-stakes world of Sienna, a moonwolf who went from being a rejected bride to the savior of a kingdom. Just imagine this. It's your wedding day. You're about to marry the powerful Alpha Lorenzo and finally escape a life of abuse. You're wearing a beautiful gown, thinking your suffering is over. But then, you're dragged into a council room and your whole world shatters. Your own father and fiancé accuse you of a crime you didn't commit. Your fiancé, the man you thought was your soulmate, rejects you in front of everyone. And just like that, you're banished, thrown into the mud, and left for dead. This is the brutal reality Sienna faces. But what her pack didn't know is that she was carrying a secret that could change the werewolf world forever. She was pregnant with twins, the legendary heirs of the Great White Wolf. Alone and desperate, Sienna is forced to sell her ruined wedding dress for a handful of cash just to survive. She thinks she's found a safe haven with a friend, but her nightmare is only just beginning. Betrayed once again, she's sold into a brutal human trafficking ring. Her journey takes her from a lowly laundry maid, hiding her true nature, to a high-stakes auction block. She's treated like property, her spirit almost broken. And that's where she's bought by the mysterious Mad Prince, Riccardo. Riccardo is an alpha from a rival kingdom, plagued by a generational madness that only a moonwolf can cure. He's feared by everyone, seen as a monster. But as Sienna gets to know him, she discovers a powerful second-chance mate bond, one that burns brighter than any pain from her past. For the first time, she feels seen, protected, and even cherished. But the danger is far from over. A predatory scientist named Don Silvio discovers Sienna's unique power and wants to capture her, to extract her lunar energy for his twisted experiments. He sees her and her unborn children as nothing more than specimens. And to make matters worse, her original alpha, Lorenzo, learns about her pregnancy. Realizing the power of the heirs he threw away, he becomes obsessed with getting his property back. Sienna is now trapped in a terrifying web of greed, science, and obsession, hunted by two powerful men who will stop at nothing to possess her. She is caught between the man who sees her as a cure and the man who sees her as a possession. The constant running, the fear for her unborn children, it all leads to a climactic battle beneath the Sovereign Moon Palace. Sienna realizes she can't run anymore. It's time to fight back. In a breathtaking display of power, she stops hiding and fully embraces her identity as a moonwolf. She unleashes a blinding lunar energy, a raw, protective force fueled by a mother's rage. She proves to everyone that her will to protect her children is more powerful than any Alpha-S law or Scientist-S scalpel. This is an incredible story of survival, second chances, and the ultimate transformation of a woman who was once a victim. Sienna's journey from a rejected outcast to a powerful queen is absolutely epic. The question is, can she and Riccardo rebuild a kingdom bankrupted by greed? And more importantly, can they protect their precious, silver-furred heirs from the shadows of their past that continue to haunt them? If you are obsessed with fated mates, powerful heroines, and epic revenge stories, you absolutely need to watch this one. The twists and turns will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thanks for watching. If you think Lorenzo got what he deserved, make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe for more deep dives into your favorite supernatural dramas. And I have to ask, comment below, if you were Sienna, could you have forgiven the queen for her betrayal? Let me know your thoughts. See you in the next video.
The next morning, Angela arrived at the cheap hotel room Sienna had rented. She dropped a small bag of coins on the bed and sat beside her friend. They talked for hours, Sienna weeping as she described Lorenzo's cold eyes and her father's betrayal. "You cannot stay here," Angela said, gripping Sienna's hands. "I know a woman in the next town who owns a laundry and dry cleaning business. She needs help. You can live in the back room and earn enough to eat. Nobody will look for a moonwealth bride in a pile of dirty linens." 1 month later, Sienna pulled a heavy basket of wet sheets toward the dryer. The steam in the laundry room was thick, making her head spin. Lately, the smell of the detergent made her stomach turn. She leaned against the wall, waiting for the world to stop tilting. "You have been pale for weeks, Sienna," Angela said, walking into the back room with a concerned look. "It is just the heat," Sienna lied, but she couldn't stop the sudden wave of nausea. She doubled over, retching into a bin. Angela moved quickly, pulling Sienna's hair back. She waited until the coughing fit passed. "I have seen this before. We are going to the apothecary." The results were undeniable. Sienna sat on a wooden stool in the back of the shop, her hand resting over her flat stomach. "You are pregnant, Sienna," Angela whispered. "Twins. Lorenzo's heirs." Sienna felt a cold shiver go down her spine. Those babies were a death sentence. Lorenzo would either kill them or use them as pawns in his war for power. "I know a man," Angela said, her voice dropping to a low murmur. "He handles things for girls in trouble. He can make the babies go away." Sienna looked at her friend, her heart breaking. She thought of her own mother and the life she had lost. I have to. I cannot bring them into this world as slaves." "Then we go now," Angela said, grabbing her coat. They climbed into a dark SUV parked behind the laundry. A silent man named March sat in the driver's seat. As the car pulled away, Sienna noticed they weren't heading toward the city clinic. They were driving deep into the woods, toward the sovereign moon border. "Angela, this is the wrong way," Sienna said, her voice rising in fear. "Stop the car." Angela didn't look back. Her kind face had turned into a mask of stone. "I am sorry, Sienna," Angela said. "But a moon wolf is worth more than a laundry maid. You aren't going to a doctor. You are going to a buyer. You sold me. Kill me." Riccardo stared at the ceiling of his bedroom in the sovereign moon kingdom. His skin felt like it was being flayed by invisible knives. He could hear the doctor whispering to his mother, the queen, in the hallway, their voices muffled but clear to his wolf ears. "The sedative is not working anymore," the doctor said. "The prince's condition is not medical. It is a magical curse. His blood is boiling with a generational madness that no human medicine can touch." Riccardo gripped the edge of his mattress, his knuckles turning white. He was the Mad Prince, a monster kept in a gilded cage. Every few hours, the fits of anger and loss of control returned, threatening to turn him into a beast that would tear the castle apart. "There must be a way," the queen pleaded. "Only the power of a moon wolf can lift it," the doctor whispered. "The last female of that bloodline is the key to his salvation, but she is lost to the world." Riccardo let out a ragged breath. He was tired of living as a burden to his parents. He knew the measures his mother took, dulling the knives in the kitchen, removing the green flowers he hated, and hiding specific books from the library to keep him from harming himself. It made him feel like a prisoner in his own skin. If a moon wolf was his only hope, he would not wait for his mother's rewards to find her. He would not sit in this bed until the madness finally claimed his mind for good. He sat up, his vision swimming as the latest sedative began to wear off. His fate was tied to a ghost, a woman he had never met. "I am going to find her," Riccardo muttered to the empty room. He stood up, his legs shaking but his mind resolute. He would leave the palace tonight. He would hunt for his salvation in the dark corners of the werewolf lands where the law did not reach. "You cannot go out there, Riccardo," a voice said from the shadows. His brother, Jackson, stepped into the light, a mocking smile on his face. "Try to stop me. Wake up, 209. Sienna flinched as a cold bucket of water hit her face. She gasped for air, her eyes snapping open to see iron bars. She was in a cage. Around her, 5 other girls dressed in filthy rags huddled together, their eyes hollow with terror. The air smelled of damp stone and unwashed bodies. "Where are they?" Sienna rasped, her throat burning. "Where Angela and March?" The girl closest to her let out a broken laugh. "They got their payday. You are in the cellar of the Red Den now. We have all been sold to the brothel." Sienna's heart plummeted. She clutched her stomach, feeling the faint, protective pulse of the twins inside her. She felt weak, the hunger gnawing at her ribs like a physical weight. Before she could process the betrayal, the heavy door at the top of the stairs creaked open. March walked in, followed by a man in a pristine white lab coat. "That is the one," March said, pointing at Sienna. The man in the white coat, Don Silvio, stepped toward the bars. He didn't look like a customer, he looked like a butcher. He adjusted his glasses and stared at Sienna with a predatory intensity. "The last moon wolf," Silvio whispered, a twisted smile pulling at his lips. "She is wasted in a place like this. I will pay double to take her to the auction tonight." "She is already the main event, Doctor," the brothel owner replied. Sienna was dragged from the cage and forced into a room where they scrubbed her skin until it bled. They dressed her in a sheer, gold-threaded gown that left nothing to the imagination. When they pushed her onto the auction stage, the light blinded her. Thousands of men sat in the shadows, their minds projecting a thick, suffocating cloud of lust that made her skin crawl. "The bidding starts at $500,000 for the moon wolf," the auctioneer screamed. "500,000, Silvio called out immediately from the front row. A collective gasp rippled through the room. One of the servants had whispered to Sienna that Silvio was a cruel scientist who experimented on the women he bought until they ended up dead. Sienna's legs trembled. She was looking into her own grave. 600,000. The voice came from the back of the room, deep and commanding. A man stood up, his face partially hidden by the collar of a dark coat. It was Riccardo. The moment their eyes met, a jolt of electricity shot through Sienna's spine. It was the mate bond, the second-chance mate she never thought she would find. 1 million, Silvio snapped, not even looking back. 1.5, Riccardo countered, his voice steady. The room fell silent as the price soared. Riccardo looked desperate, his eyes burning with a light that wasn't entirely sane. Silvio laughed and named a price, so high the auctioneer stopped breathing. Riccardo reached into his pockets, but his face fell. He had left the palace with nothing but the clothes on his back. "Sold to Don Silvio," the auctioneer yelled, slamming the gavel. Sienna was dragged off the stage as Riccardo lunged forward, only to be held back by guards. She was thrown into the back of Silvio's black sedan and driven to his private estate. Silvio entered the bedroom, his eyes dark with a horrific intent. He wanted to defile her before the experiments began. As he reached for the hem of her gown, the bedroom door exploded off its hinges. Riccardo stood there, his wolf surfacing in a terrifying display of teeth and claws. "Touch her and you die. I am not your toy, Riccardo." Sienna's voice cracked as she backed away from the man standing in the center of the massive, velvet-draped bedroom. Her head throbbed, and her vision blurred from the dizzying fatigue of the rescue. She had woken up in these silken sheets after collapsing in his arms at the scientist's estate. "You are a guest, Sienna," Riccardo said, his voice low and strained. "I am a prisoner," she snapped. She could feel the heat of the mate connection radiating between them, a magnetic pull that made her heart race, but she fought it with every ounce of her will. "You bought me at an auction. You are just like Silvio. You are just another pervert who wants to own a moon wolf." Riccardo flinched at the name, a flash of red crossing his eyes. Suddenly, he shouted, the sound echoing off the marble walls. Sienna cowered, her heel catching on the thick rug, and she nearly hit the floor before he moved with predatory speed to steady her. "Listen to me," Riccardo growled, his hands firm on her shoulders. "I had to pay Silvio his money to stop him from hunting you. If I did not, he would have gone back to the brothel to collect his debt, and they would have sold you to someone worse." Sienna's breath hitched. She realized then that she was trapped by more than just walls. She was trapped by a debt she could never hope to pay. "How much?" she whispered. "More than you have," Riccardo replied. "Stay. Marry me, and the debt is gone." "Never," Sienna spat, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I would rather be a servant. I will work in this castle for as long as it takes to pay you back every cent." Riccardo stared at her for a long beat, his expression unreadable. "Fine. If that is your choice, you will work. I will fire 7 of the castle staff today. You will take on the tasks of 5 people for the next 6 months." Sienna tightened her jaw, ignoring the sharp twinge in her belly that reminded her she was carrying another man's children. "And if you falter?" Riccardo stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "If you fail a single duty, you will marry me by force. I will not fail. Do not let the prince's money make you think you are special. The head of servants stood in the center of the assembly ground, her eyes scanning the row of exhausted maids. Sienna stood among them, her back aching from a night of restless sleep on a thin mattress. Her mind kept drifting to March and Angela. A cold fury burned in her chest at the thought of them. She wanted justice, but she was trapped in a castle, paying off a debt for a rescue she had never asked for. You are in the kitchen today, Sienna, the head servant barked, pointing a finger at her. And do not be late for the introduction. Sienna followed the group into the assembly hall, where the air suddenly grew stiff and formal. A woman stood at the front of the room, draped in silks and jewels that sparkled under the chandeliers. This is Contessa Goldfield, the head servant announced. The prince's betrothed and daughter of Randall Goldfield. You will show her the same respect you show the queen. Sienna felt like she had been punched in the stomach. Riccardo had asked her to marry him while he was already engaged to the daughter of a billionaire. The insult stung more than she cared to admit. She brushed the thought away, focusing on the kitchen tasks she had been assigned. In the kitchen, the heat was suffocating. Sienna was tasked with tending to a massive pot of chicken soup. She noticed the pot was tilted on the stove, the metal warped and unstable. Excuse me, Sienna started, trying to flag down the head servant. The stove is... Hush and stir, girl, a large woman shouted, shoving a wooden spoon into Sienna's hand. Sienna returned to the pot, but the hair on her neck stood up. She turned to find Contessa standing in the kitchen doorway, glaring at her with pure venom. The princess moved closer, her presence chilling the air despite the heat of the ovens. Who are you? Contessa asked, her voice a sharp blade. Sienna didn't have time to answer. As she reached out to adjust the warped pot, the metal groaned. The heavy container tipped, sending gallons of boiling soup crashing onto the floor in a wave of scalding liquid. Look what you have done. Do you have any idea what you have just done, you useless thing? The boiling soup spread across the stone floor like a tidal wave of grease and heat. Maids began squealing and jumping back to avoid the mess, but Sienna stood frozen. Before she could even stammer an apology, Contessa stomped through the puddle. Her hand moved in a blur and a sharp, stinging slap echoed through the kitchen. Sienna's head snapped to the side. The pain radiated through her jaw, but the real shock was the jolt to her belly. She gasped, clutching her stomach instinctively. You are just a slut off the street, Contessa hissed, her face inches from Sienna's. An inanimate object the prince wasted money on. Money my father contributed to this kingdom. Sienna's eyes widened. Contessa knew. She knew about the auction and the debt. The kitchen doors swung open again. A woman in regal, flowing silks stepped into the chaos. The other maids immediately fell to their faces, bowing low. This was the queen. She looked at the spilled soup and then at Sienna, who was now trembling on her knees. What has happened here? The queen asked, her voice calm but commanding. This animal ruined the royal dinner, Contessa snapped. She must be punished. She stays on her knees until I say otherwise. The queen placed a gentle hand on Contessa's shoulder, trying to pacify the younger woman. Sienna watched the exchange, realizing with a sinking heart that Contessa held power even over the queen herself. Let her serve the rest of her punishment in my quarters, the queen suggested. She will clean my chambers and wash all my clothes. Contessa scoffed, calling Sienna a useless thing once more, but eventually agreed and stormed out. The queen led Sienna away, but instead of handing her a mop, she took her into a private room and told her to sit. She even offered Sienna food, asking questions about her life and her family. Be close to my son, the queen whispered before leaving for urgent business. He is not a bad person. Sienna finished her cleaning and retired to the maid's quarters, only to find Riccardo waiting in the shadows. She scowled at him immediately. Find a way to arrest March, Sienna demanded, her voice shaking with repressed anger. If he is caught, he can pay the debt I owe you. Then I can leave this place. Riccardo stepped closer, his expression unreadable. There is no need to arrest March. He has already done what was needed of him. Sienna stepped back, her confusion turning into a cold, sharp fear. What do you mean he did what was needed? March has already played his role in your life, Sienna. Sienna stood frozen as Riccardo spoke. The air in the corridor felt thin. She had expected him to offer the resources of the crown to hunt down her kidnappers, but instead, he stood there with a look of chilling indifference. His role? Sienna's voice rose, her hands curling into fists. He kidnapped me. He sold me in a cage like an animal. If you find him, he owes the money for my debt, not me. If he were found and paid your debt, you would leave this castle, Riccardo said, taking a step toward her. His eyes were dark, devoid of the madness, but filled with a different kind of intensity. And I do not want you to leave. You have no right to keep me hostage. Sienna snapped. I deserve to live freely. I deserve to have my own life. There is nothing out there for you but predators, Sienna, he countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. The safest place for you is in this castle with me. If you walked out those gates today, you would instantly regret it. Before she could scream back at him, the sound of clicking heels echoed down the hall. Contessa appeared, her face a mask of simmering rage. Riccardo immediately went cold, dismissing Sienna with a sharp flick of his wrist. Sienna retreated to the servants' quarters, her mind spinning with Riccardo's cryptic warnings. She found her friend Maya waiting by her bunk. You need to watch your back, Maya whispered, leaning in close. Contessa is beyond furious. She just ordered the head servant to have your hair cut off. And tomorrow, you aren't in the kitchen. She assigned you to wash the cars in the garage. Sienna let out a tired laugh. That is a man's job. Exactly, Maya said. She wants to break you. Sienna laid back and closed her eyes, trying to ignore the dull ache in her pregnant belly. She told herself it didn't matter. If washing cars helped pay the debt faster, she would do it. But as sleep finally began to pull at her, the heavy wooden door to the room creaked open. Every other maid was fast asleep, their breathing rhythmic and deep. Sienna sat up quickly, her heart hammering. Riccardo stood in the doorway. He didn't say a word, he simply beckoned for her to follow him. He led her through the winding, silent halls of the royal wing until they reached his private suite. You will sleep in this room from now on, Riccardo said, pointing to the massive bed. Sienna stared at him, her exhaustion replaced by a fresh wave of fear. You think because you bought me, I am your toy? I am not a toy for you to play with just because you paid for me, Riccardo. Sienna stood at the edge of the massive suite, her eyes widening as she took in the space. The room was enormous, and Riccardo had made almost no effort to separate the sleeping arrangements. She would practically be sleeping right beside him on the same bed. The idea made her stomach churn with a mixture of anger and fear. I need you in here, Riccardo said, his voice unusually gentle. Give me one good reason, Sienna demanded, her voice rising. I want to leave this room. I am not a slut or an inanimate object for you to toy with. Suddenly, Riccardo snapped. Stay in the room. The force of his shout echoed off the walls. Sienna cowered, stepping back so quickly that she tripped over a rug, nearly crashing to the floor. Riccardo reached out to steady her, his expression hard. I still need my money, he growled. If you stay in the room with the other maids, you might not live long enough to work for it. You will not be strong enough. Sienna knew he was lying, but the shock of his shouting had already done its damage. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and a sharp pain flared in her belly. Her knees buckled. Riccardo caught her before she hit the ground. Seeing her pale face, he quickly scooped her up and carried her into the bathroom. He began pouring cool water over her face, his hands surprisingly careful. He helped her out of her soiled clothes, pouring more water over her skin to help her recover from the heat and the shock. The last thing Sienna remembered was the scent of his skin before she drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep. When she woke up early the next morning, she was shocked to find herself wrapped tightly in Riccardo's arms. Her head was resting on his chest, and she could hear the steady thrum of his heart. For a moment, she allowed herself to look at him. Without the anger or the madness, he looked innocent. She found herself admiring his red lips and the chiseled lines of his face. Riccardo stirred, his grip tightening. Sienna quickly closed her eyes, pretending to be fast asleep. To her utter surprise, she felt his hand gently caress her hair. A moment later, He leaned down and kissed her softly on the lips. "What do you think you are doing? What do you think you are doing?" Sienna flinched as she opened her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs. She attempted to jump off the bed, but Riccardo's hand was like a vice. He grabbed her wrist and pulled her back, leaning closer until his body pinned her against the mattress. "You have the most beautiful eyes I have ever seen," Riccardo whispered. His voice was thick, almost like he was in a trance. Sienna felt a sting of sincerity in his words that melted into her heart, despite how much she wanted to hate him. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his gaze searching hers. "Has the dizziness left? Have your nerves relaxed?" Sienna opened her mouth to answer, but the words died in her throat. The heavy bedroom door was thrown open with such force it slammed against the wall. Contessa stood there, her face twisted with a rage so pure it made the air in the room feel heavy. "You betrayer!" Contessa screamed, her eyes darting between Riccardo and Sienna. Riccardo hopped off the bed in a blur of movement. He didn't defend Sienna, he didn't even look at her. "Go back to the maids' quarters. Now." Sienna didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled out of the bed and fled the room, but she didn't go far. She stopped just outside the door, her lungs burning as she pressed her ear to the wood. "I am not sleeping with her," Riccardo's voice pleaded from inside. Sienna's skin crawled with irritation. Even though she knew their mate bond was screaming for a deeper connection, he was groveling to that woman. "Sleeping with that slut will not change your condition, Riccardo," Contessa spat. "It is not a solution. My father could have handled this the right way. He could have extracted whatever powers she has in his lab and given them to you as medicine. Instead, you disrespect yourself by touching a low-born maid." Sienna's blood turned to ice. "Extraction? Science?" She didn't wait to hear more. She heard footsteps approaching and ran until she reached the servants' quarters. Maya was waiting for her, holding a small bottle of medicine Riccardo had sent her to buy the day before. Maya's eyes were wide with worry as she pulled Sienna into a corner. "I know the truth, Sienna," Maya whispered. "I know you are pregnant. You have to keep that belly hidden, Sienna, or you are a dead woman." Maya leaned in so close I could smell the medicinal herbs on her breath. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. In this kingdom, a maid with a child was a crime. If the queen or Contessa found out, my babies wouldn't be mine, they would be property, sent to work in the gold mines or Silvio's labs until they died. "I understand," I whispered, clutching the medicine Maya handed me. "Thank you." I spent the day in a blur of nausea and fear, scrubbing windows while my body screamed for rest. By afternoon, the palace was in a frenzy. An impromptu ball was being thrown for foreign dignitaries coming to talk trade with the sovereign moon. Maya found me near the ballroom, shoving a box of decorations into my hands. "You're in charge of the ballroom," she said, her eyes darting around to make sure we weren't overheard. I headed toward the library to find a ladder, but I stopped dead at the sound of a voice. It was Riccardo. He wasn't talking to Contessa or his mother. He sounded desperate, begging someone to end his life. "Why don't you just kill me?" he yelled, followed by a terrifying, heavy crash. I dropped my supplies and burst into the library. The room was a wreck. Riccardo was slumped in the corner, his shirt soaked with sweat and his body shivering. A heavy Chinese vase lay shattered around him, and a deep, jagged cut on his wrist was pouring blood onto the carpet. "Get out," he roared when he saw me, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "I hate you. I hate everyone." He was lost in the madness, a fit so deep he didn't even recognize me. I didn't run. I walked toward him, my voice low and steady as I reached out to touch his face. The moment my skin met his, the shivering stopped. His eyes cleared, the madness receding like a tide. He didn't say thank you. He lunged forward, grabbing me by the waist and pulling me into a hard, desperate kiss that tasted like copper and salt. "Do not ever leave me," he breathed against my lips, his hands shaking as they trailed over my skin. I felt my wolf stir, my senses drowning in the heat of the bond. I loved him, but as I looked at the blood on his wrist and the gold ring on his finger, I knew it was a lie. "I am going to pay my debt, Riccardo," I said, pulling away and wiping my mouth. "And then you will never have to see me again." You are going to stand beside him, hold his hand, and you are going to look exactly like Contessa. The queen's words hit me harder than the slap in the kitchen. I stood in her chambers, looking from the regal woman on the bed to Riccardo, who sat on a velvet couch with his head in his hands. Contessa sat beside the queen, her eyes narrowed in a triumph that made my skin crawl. Why can she not do it? I asked, gesturing toward Contessa. She is his betrothed. She was not with him while he practiced, the queen replied coldly. She does not ease his anxiety. You do. I realized then that this was not about my debt. Riccardo was terrified of the crowds. Without me acting as his anchor, he would lose control, shift in front of the dignitaries, or sink back into the madness. They were using me as a human sedative. The ball was a blur of heavy silk and suffocating masks. I stood on the dais, my hand gripped firmly in Riccardo's as he delivered a speech that sounded like a rehearsed lie. Every time his grip tightened, I felt the twins kick, as if they knew the danger we were in. The moment the speech ended, I fled back to my quarters to strip off the suffocating dress. I turned toward the mirror and froze. You look too valuable for a prince's pocket change, Sienna, a voice drawled from the shadows. Jackson stepped forward, a sly smile playing on his lips. He looked me up and down, his gaze lingering on my face. You are not a regular wolf. You do not even know what you truly are, do you? Leave me alone, Jackson, I snapped, pulling a robe over my shoulders. You think they want you for your company? He laughed, a dry, hollow sound. This place is a trap. If you know what is good for you, you will find a way to leave before the moon reaches its peak. Before I could demand an explanation, Riccardo burst into the room. The disdain on his face when he saw his brother was enough to crack the stone walls. We are leaving, Riccardo barked, grabbing my arm. Now. We are going to a neighboring kingdom and you are staying in that dress. What about Contessa? I demanded as he dragged me toward the carriage. She stays here, he muttered. We cannot risk anyone seeing the truth. The drive was silent and suffocating. We arrived at a small manor, and the moment the doors closed behind us, the argument erupted. Why am I still pretending to be her? I screamed, my voice echoing in the marble hall. Why are you hiding me like a dirty secret? Jackson is a liar. Riccardo roared back, his eyes flashing gold. He is not a good person, Sienna. Do not trust a word he says. At least he is sincere. I yelled. You are a stranger who has destroyed my life. The room began to spin. The anger, the travel, and the weight of the secret pregnancy crashed down on me all at once. My knees gave out, and the world turned black before I could hear his answer. Sienna, why didn't you tell me you were pregnant? Sienna struggled to open her eyes as the room came into focus. She was still in the small kingdom they had visited, her body feeling heavy and broken after the fainting spell. A maid stood by the bedside, her face pale with concern as she asked why Sienna had been neglecting her self-care and her pregnancy. Sienna had tried to hush the woman, but the door had burst open to reveal Riccardo. And why are you trying to keep this from me? Riccardo demanded, his fury filling the room. Tears welled in Sienna's eyes, but she bit her lip, refusing to explain. Despite her silence, the secret was gone. Within hours, word spread through the small kingdom that the woman they believed to be Cecilia Goldfield was carrying the royal heir. The local duke declared a celebration, and the entire kingdom erupted in joy at the news of the coming heir. Sienna and Riccardo could only sit in uncomfortable silence as the festivities continued around them, the news already traveling back to the sovereign moonlands. The journey back was a nightmare of unspoken tension. The moment they returned to the castle, Sienna hurried to her small quarters and stripped off the gown, desperate to feel like herself again in her servant's uniform. She didn't even have time to lace her boots before the door was kicked open. Contessa stormed in, her eyes blazing with a lethal fire. How dare you bring such a disgusting pregnancy into this castle? Contessa seethed. Before Sienna could breathe, Contessa's hand moved. The slap was so hard it nearly knocked Sienna unconscious. Sienna collapsed to the floor, her ears ringing. Why didn't you tell Riccardo before he bought you? Contessa screamed, hitting her again. Sienna curled into a ball, clutching her belly as a sharp, stabbing pain shot through her womb. She lay there in agony until the head servant entered, shouting at her to get up and serve the royal family. Dragging herself to her feet, Sienna painfully made her way to the dining hall. She stepped through the doors and froze. Her heart seemed to stop beating entirely. Sitting at the table next to Contessa was her father, Sebastian Goldfield. The man was not just a council elder, he was the scientist who had bid on her at the auction. He was the man who had planned to use her for his experiments and discard her body. Sebastian's eyes locked onto hers, and a twisted, mischievous smirk spread across his face. "Recognize me, little wolf? Recognize me, little wolf?" Sienna felt the blood drain from her face as she stood frozen, staring at the man who sat beside Contessa. Sebastian Goldfield. He was the butcher from the auction, the scientist who had looked at her like a piece of meat he wanted to carve open. Her legs trembled so violently she thought she might collapse right there on the dining room rug. "You are late with the wine, servant," Contessa snapped, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of Sienna's terror. Sienna moved on autopilot, her hands shaking as she filled the glasses. She had to listen in horror as the two families discussed the upcoming wedding. Because the kingdom believed Contessa was the one carrying Riccardo's heir, the marriage was being moved up. Sebastian's eyes never left her, locked on her with a mischievous smirk that promised a future of needles and cold steel. The moment the queen dismissed her, Sienna fled. She didn't go to the kitchen. She ran straight to her small quarters and began frantically throwing her things into a bag. She couldn't stay, not with Sebastian in the castle, not with the extraction looming. Running won't save you from a fated bond, Sienna. Jackson stood in the doorway, blocking her only exit. He didn't look like he was there to stop her. He looked like he was there to make a deal. "The plan is already in motion," Jackson whispered, stepping into the room. "Sebastian isn't just here for a wedding. He is here to extract your healing powers to cure Riccardo's madness. They think they can bottle your soul and discard the rest." "Why are you telling me this?" Sienna gripped her bag, her knuckles white. "Because they are fools," Jackson said, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "The curse can only truly be broken if you stay with him, marry him, and consummate the union. But if you want to live to see those twins breathe, you need to go. Now." He handed her a small iron key. "The servants' tunnel. It leads past the gates." Sienna didn't ask questions. She waited until the moon was high and the castle fell into a heavy, artificial silence. She crept through the damp tunnels, her breath hitching at every drip of water. She reached the end of the stone path and pushed open the hidden grate, stumbling out into the freezing night air of the forest. She ran until her lungs burned, her feet sinking into the mud. She was free. She was finally free. "Did you really think I wouldn't track my own property?" Sienna froze. Emerging from the shadows was a face she hadn't seen since her banishment. Lorenzo. He wasn't alone. His elite guards surrounded her, their eyes glowing a predatory red in the dark. "You are coming back to the Moonwealth, Sienna," Lorenzo growled. "The council will execute us both if we walk through those gates without a plan, Riccardo." Sienna gripped the edge of the carriage seat as the marble spires of the Sovereign Moon Palace broke through the morning mist. Beside her, Riccardo sat with his jaw tight, his skin still pale from the exhaustion of the forest shift. He reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers with a strength that felt like an anchor. "They cannot execute a king who has found his soul," Riccardo said, his voice a low, steady rumble. The carriage pulled into the courtyard, and the silence that greeted them was deafening. The guards, usually brisk and disciplined, stood like statues. Word had already reached the castle of the celebration in the neighboring kingdom, and the news that the woman they thought was Contessa was actually a pregnant maid. As they stepped onto the stone tiles, the heavy doors of the palace swung open. The queen stood at the top of the stairs, her face a mask of regal stone. Beside her was Don Silvio, his lab coat replaced by a dark, formal suit, and Contessa, whose eyes were red with a mix of fury and humiliation. "You have made a mockery of this kingdom, Riccardo," the queen said, her voice echoing off the walls. "The mockery was the lie we told to protect a crown that was already broken," Riccardo countered. He pulled Sienna closer to his side, his arm a protective barrier. "Sienna is my mate. She is the mother of the true heirs. And she is the one who broke the curse. Silvio stepped forward, a cold, clinical smile touching his lips. A curse is not broken by sentiment, Prince. It is broken by biology. Whatever power she has belongs to the state. The extraction will proceed tonight, as discussed. Sienna felt the twins' kick, a sharp, frantic movement that made her gasp. She looked at Silvio, the man who had bit on her in a cage, and felt the fear transform into a cold, hard resolve. "You will not touch me again," Sienna said, her voice small but steady. "And who will stop me?" Silvio laughed, glancing at the line of palace guards. "A rejected stray?" "I will," Riccardo said. He took a step forward, and for a moment, his eyes flashed that blinding, iridescent white from the forest. The guards nearest to him instinctively took a step back, their instincts recognizing the great white wolf before their eyes did. "The council is waiting inside," the queen interrupted, her gaze shifting between her son and the woman she had once shown pity to. "They will decide if this kingdom follows the blood of a maid or the gold of the goldfields." Sienna walked up the stairs, her head held high even as her legs trembled. She passed Contessa, who leaned in to whisper a final venomous threat. "You're nothing but a laboratory specimen, Sienna. Once they have what they need, you will be discarded like the rest." Sienna didn't answer. She followed Riccardo into the great hall, where the elders of the sovereign moon sat in a semicircle of shadows. At the center sat Randall Goldfield, the richest elder and the man who held the kingdom's debts in his hands. "You claim to be the savior of the prince," Randall said, his voice like grinding gravel. "Prove it. If you are a moon wolf, show us the light. If you are just a pregnant girl, you leave tonight in Silvio's custody." Riccardo squeezed her hand. "Do it, Sienna. Show them what you are." "What if I can't?" "You will have to kill me before I let you touch me again, Lorenzo." Lorenzo stepped out of the tree line, the silver moonlight catching the cruel twist of his mouth. Behind him, his elite guards fanned out, their eyes glowing with the hunger of the hunt. Sienna's heart hammered against her ribs, and she clutched her bag, her fingers brushing the cold iron of the kitchen knife she had hidden in her tunic. "You were always dramatic, Sienna," Lorenzo growled, his voice vibrating with alpha authority. "But you are carrying something that belongs to the Moonwealth pack. My heirs. They are not yours," she spat, backing away until her heels hit the rough bark of an ancient oak. "You rejected me. You threw me to the wolves. These children have nothing to do with a coward like you." Lorenzo signaled his men. They closed the circle, their shifting forms making the dry leaves crunch underfoot. "The law says otherwise. A rejected mate's firstborn belongs to the alpha of her origin. You are coming back to the pits, and once those brats are born, we will see how much of that moon wolf fire is left in you." Sienna pulled the knife. One of the guards lunged. She swung, but he grabbed her wrist, twisting it until the blade clattered to the mud. She gasped as he pinned her against the tree, his breath smelling of raw meat and rot. "Enough." The voice did not come from the woods. It dropped from the darkness above. A shadow hit the ground with a force that cracked the earth. Riccardo stood there, his clothes soaked in the sweat of a brewing fit. His eyes were not gold, they were a blinding, iridescent white that bled into the night. "Get your hands off my mate," Riccardo whispered. Lorenzo laughed, though he stepped back. "The mad prince. I heard you were falling apart, Riccardo. This stray isn't worth a war between packs." "She isn't a stray," Riccardo said, his form beginning to blur as his bones snapped and reformed. "She is the sovereign moon. And you are trespassing." Riccardo shifted. It was an explosion of silver, fur, and muscle. He was a great white wolf, a creature of legend, looming over Lorenzo's guards. With a single swipe of his paw, he sent the Moonwealth men flying into the underbrush. Lorenzo shifted too, his brown wolf snarling, but he was half the size of Riccardo. They clashed in a blur of teeth and fur. Sienna watched, frozen, as Riccardo tore into Lorenzo's shoulder, pinning the alpha to the dirt. Riccardo's muzzle was inches from Lorenzo's throat, a low rumble shaking the ground. "Riccardo, stop!" Sienna screamed. "If you kill him, the council will execute you." The great white wolf paused. He turned his massive head toward her, his glowing eyes searching hers. He stepped off Lorenzo's broken body and shifted back, standing shivering in the moonlight. Sienna ran to him, wrapping her shawl around his shoulders. "I found you," he wheezed, his hand reaching up to touch her cheek. "We have to go," she whispered, looking at the wounded Lorenzo. "Sebastian is still coming. They are all coming." Riccardo gripped her hand. "Let them come. No more running, Sienna. We are going back to take the throne. And if the council does not accept me?" "The council does not care for your heart, Riccardo. They care for your power." The heavy oak doors of the council chamber groaned as they swung open. Sienna walked at Riccardo's side, her chin tilted high even as her stomach did somersaults. The room was a semicircle of shadows, occupied by 12 elders whose eyes were as cold as the stone floor. At the center sat Randall Goldfield, his face a landscape of deep-set wrinkles and greed. Beside the elders stood Sebastian Goldfield, his clinical gaze lingering on Sienna's midsection. He held a silver briefcase that looked entirely too much like a surgical kit. "You bring a common maid into the Hall of Kings, Prince Riccardo," Randall said, his voice echoing. "And you claim she is the salvation of our line?" "She is the last moon wolf," Riccardo stated, his voice booming with an authority that silenced the murmurs. "She has already stabilized my mind. The curse is broken." Sebastian stepped forward, a thin, mocking smile on his face. "Stabilized? Or merely delayed? My research shows that the power of the moon wolf must be distilled to be permanent. Without the extraction, the prince remains a danger to us all. The extraction will kill her and her children." Riccardo roared, the air in the room beginning to vibrate. "A small price for the safety of the sovereign moon," Randall countered. "Unless, of course, the girl can prove her worth. If she truly holds the power of the moon, let her manifest it now. If she cannot, she is merely a vessel to be emptied." Sienna stepped forward, her hands trembling. She felt the eyes of the elders, the cold smirk of Sebastian, and the desperate hope of Riccardo. She closed her eyes, trying to reach deep inside for the light they demanded. She felt nothing but the frantic kicking of the twins. The silence in the room stretched until it became a physical weight. "Nothing," Sebastian whispered, reaching for his briefcase. "Guards, seize the specimen." As the guards moved in, Sienna felt a sudden, white-hot spark in the center of her chest. It wasn't a spark of power, it was a spark of rage. The air around her began to shimmer with a pale, silver light. "You will not touch my children," Sienna whispered. The silver light exploded from her in a blinding wave, throwing the guards back and rattling the council's stone table. For a heartbeat, the entire room was bathed in the brilliance of a full moon. Randall Goldfield shielded his eyes, his face pale. Sebastian stumbled back, his briefcase clattering to the floor. "Is that enough proof for you?" Riccardo asked, his eyes glowing white. "The council will deliberate," Randall stammered, his voice shaking. But as the light faded, Sienna saw Sebastian whispering to a guard. The scientist wasn't finished. If he couldn't take her by law, he would take her by force. "We need to leave the city tonight, Riccardo." "The shadow of a crown is not the same as wearing one, Sienna." Riccardo paced the length of the royal bedchamber, his boots clicking against the marble like a countdown. The silver manifestation in the council hall had bought them time, but the silence following the meeting felt like a trap. Sienna sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on the swell of her stomach where the twins remained restless. "Sebastian is not going to wait for a vote," Sienna said, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw the way he looked at me. I am not a person to him. I am a solution to a problem he wants to sell." "He is already moving his men," Riccardo growled, stopping to look out the window at the darkened city. "My mother thinks she can control him, but Silvio has been the true power behind the sovereign moon for years. He owns the gold, and he owns the council." A soft knock at the door made them both jump. Maya slipped inside, her face pale and her servant's uniform wrinkled. She held a heavy cloak and a satchel of supplies. "You have to leave now," Maya urged, her eyes darting toward the hallway. "I heard the head of the guards taking orders from Silvio. They're coming to move you to the lab under the cover of the midnight shift change." "Jackson promised a tunnel," Sienna reminded them, looking at Riccardo. Jackson is playing his own game, Riccardo warned, grabbing his coat. But the underground passage to the old cathedral is our only chance to bypass the Goldfield perimeter. They moved through the servants' quarters in total silence, avoiding the main halls where the royal guard stood watch. Sienna felt every step in her lower back, the weight of the pregnancy making the quick movements agonizing. They reached the heavy iron grate behind the kitchen, the same spot where the soup had spilled weeks ago. Riccardo heaved the grate open, the rusted hinges groaning. He dropped down first and reached up to catch Sienna. The air in the tunnel was thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. "We go to the border," Riccardo whispered, his eyes glowing white to light the path. "We find the Moonwealth rebels. If we can unite the fringe packs, we come back with an army Silvio cannot buy." As they emerged from the other end of the tunnel near the forest line, a spotlight cut through the darkness, pinning them against the stone wall. "I told you, Riccardo," Sebastian Goldfield's voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "The extraction is a matter of state security. You cannot hide the cure forever." A dozen men in tactical gear stepped out of the shadows, their rifles aimed at Sienna's heart. "Step away from the specimen, Prince. The only thing you are extracting tonight is a death sentence, Silvio." Riccardo did not wait for the tactical team to fire. He stepped in front of Sienna, his body expanding with a sickening series of cracks as he shifted into the great white wolf mid-stride. The spotlight reflected off his silver fur, making him look like a vengeful god carved from ice. Sienna scrambled back toward the stone wall, her hand clutched over her belly. The twins were silent now, almost as if they were holding their breath. "Fire the tranquilizers," Silvio screamed over the loudspeaker. "Do not damage the specimen, but bring the beast down." A volley of pressurized darts hissed through the air. Riccardo caught three in his shoulder, his massive form staggering for a heartbeat. He let out a roar that shook the trees, a sound of pure, unadulterated madness that the council had feared for years. He lunged into the line of men, his claws tearing through tactical vests as if they were made of paper. Sienna looked for an opening, her eyes darting through the chaos. She saw Silvio standing behind a reinforced glass shield near the sedan, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and scientific greed. "Sienna, run!" Riccardo's voice echoed in her mind, a frantic command through the mate bond. She didn't need to be told twice. She bolted toward the dense tree line, but a shadow blocked her path. It was March, the guard who had betrayed her at the Moonwealth Pack. He held a heavy silver net, his face twisted into a cruel grin. "You've been a lot of trouble for a laundry maid, Sienna," March said, stepping closer. Sienna didn't have her kitchen knife, but she had something else, the rage of a mother whose children were being hunted. She didn't think. She let the silver light from the council hall flow into her hands. As March threw the net, she threw her palms forward. A concussive wave of lunar energy struck him square in the chest, sending him flying 30 feet back into the trunk of a pine tree. She didn't stop to see if he was breathing. She vanished into the dark woods, her lungs burning as she pushed through the thorns. "Over here," a voice hissed from the thicket. Sienna froze, her light fading. A group of wolves emerged from the shadows, not in uniform, but in mismatched leathers and scars. At their head was Maya, who had somehow bypassed the palace perimeter. "The Moonwealth rebels," Maya said, pointing to the men behind her. "They heard the Alpha was dead and the Moon Wolf was rising. We're here to take you to the border." Sienna looked back toward the spotlight where Riccardo was still fighting a dozen men. "We can't leave him. If you stay, you both die," one of the rebels said, his voice hard. "He's giving you the only head start you'll get. Move." "A queen without a throne is just a target, Sienna." The rebel camp was hidden deep within the mountain crags, a collection of tents and fires fueled by damp wood and desperation. Sienna sat on a crate, her breath coming in white puffs as the mountain air bit through her thin cloak. Around her, the Moonwealth rebels, those who had survived Lorenzo's cruelty and the fall of the pack, sharpened their blades and tended to their wounds. "I am not a queen," Sienna said, her voice raspy. "I am a woman trying to keep her children from becoming lab experiments." "You are a moon wolf," Maya countered, handing her a tin cup of bitter broth. "And the prince stayed behind to ensure you reached us. That makes you the leader of this war, whether you want it or not." Sienna looked at the rough men and women. They were outcasts, much like she had been when she was banished from the Moonwealth Pack. They had lost their homes and their families to the greed of alphas and the science of the goldfields. What happened to Riccardo? Sienna asked, looking toward the horizon where the palace lights flickered like dying stars. He was taken, a scout said, stepping into the firelight. Silvio's tactical team used heavy sedatives. They have him in the reinforced labs beneath the palace. Contessa is already bragging that the extraction will happen at dawn. Sienna felt a surge of nausea that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. She thought of Riccardo trapped in a glass cage, his power being drained to satisfy a mad scientist's greed. "We're going back," Sienna said, standing up. Her legs were shaky, but her resolve was like iron. "There are 50 of us and hundreds of them," the scout replied. "It is suicide." "They expect a moon wolf to hide," Sienna said, her hand resting on the swell of her belly where the twins moved with a strange, pulsing energy. "They do not expect a mother to burn their world down to save her mate." She looked at Maya, then at the rebels. "If you want your freedom, follow me. If you want to die as slaves in the gold mines, stay here." One by one, the rebels stood. They didn't have the fancy gear of the royal guard, but they had the rage of the forgotten. "The extraction ends tonight," Sienna whispered. The trek back to the Sovereign Moon Palace was a march of shadows. Sienna led the 50 rebels through the same damp tunnels she had used to escape, her silver light dimmed to a faint pulse to guide their way. Every step sent a jolt of pain through her back, but the twins within her felt like a burning sun, their energy fueling her resolve. "The labs are beneath the West Wing," Maya whispered, her hand tight on a stolen pulse rifle. "Silvio has his own private security there. They aren't loyal to the crown, they're loyal to his payroll." They emerged into the sterile, white-tiled corridors of the sublevels. The air tasted of ozone and chemicals. Suddenly, a siren wailed, a high-pitched scream that cut through the silence. "They know we're here," a rebel shouted. "Then let them see us," Sienna cried. She didn't hide this time. As the first wave of Silvio's tactical team rounded the corner, she threw her hands out. The silver light didn't just shimmer, it roared. A wave of pure lunar force slammed the guards against the walls, short-circuiting their electronic visors. She pushed forward, reaching a heavy reinforced glass door. Inside, Riccardo was strapped to a tilted surgical table. Tubes filled with glowing blue fluid ran from his veins into a massive processor. He looked pale, his great white wolf form flickering beneath his skin like a dying candle. Standing over him was Don Silvio, a scalpel in one hand and a vial of shimmering silver essence in the other. He turned, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and scientific obsession. "You're too late, Sienna." Silvio screamed over the alarm. "The first stage of the extraction is complete. I have the catalyst. I have the power of the gods." "You have nothing but a stolen lie," Sienna hissed, her eyes beginning to glow with a blinding, iridescent white that matched Riccardo's. The air inside the servants' tunnel felt like the breath of a dying beast, stale, cold, and heavy with the scent of damp earth. Sienna led the 50 rebels in a single-file line of shadows, her hand resting instinctively on the swell of her belly. The twins were a frantic pulse against her ribs, their energy humming in sync with the silver light that danced at the tips of her fingers to guide their path. "Jackson promised this passage would lead straight to the West Wing," Maya whispered, her grip tightening on a stolen pulse rifle. Sienna stopped dead. Ahead, the path was gone. A massive cave-in of jagged limestone and twisted iron rebar blocked their way. It wasn't an accident of age. The dust was too fresh, the edges too sharp. "It's a dead end," a rebel hissed, panic flavoring his words. "Jackson played us." Sienna stared at the rubble. She could feel the sovereign blood in her veins reacting to the trap. Jackson hadn't just blocked the path, he was testing her worthiness to lead. She didn't retreat. Instead, she pressed her palms against the cold stone, closing her eyes and reaching for the white-hot spark she had discovered in the council hall. "I didn't come back for my debt, Jackson," she whispered to the shadows. "I came back to collect yours." A concussive wave of lunar energy exploded from her palms. The stone didn't just crumble, it turned to fine powder under the sheer pressure of her rage. The path was clear. They breached the sublevels of the palace, emerging into a sterile, white-tiled corridor that smelled of ozone and antiseptic. Suddenly, a familiar figure turned the corner, the head servant, the woman who had barked orders and watched with indifference as Sienna was humiliated. The woman froze, her eyes wide with terror as 50 scarred, vengeful rebels leveled their blades at her throat. "Sienna," the woman stammered, falling to her knees. "Please. I was only following Contessa's orders." Sienna stepped forward, the silver light in her eyes casting long, predatory shadows against the wall. She remembered the soup spilling, the slaps, and the cold hunger of the maids' quarters. For a moment, the rebels waited for the order to strike. "Get up," Sienna commanded, her voice a low, steady rumble. "I have no time for revenge. You will lead us to the reinforced labs, or you will stay here and face the men you've spent years breaking. Choose." Trembling, the woman rose and pointed toward the heavy blast doors at the end of the hall. "He's in there. Don Silvio. He started the extraction an hour ago." Sienna bypassed the final security terminal, the lunar light short-circuiting the electronic locks before they could even beep. She burst into the lab, and her heart nearly stopped. Riccardo was strapped to a tilted surgical table, his body shivering as heavy sedatives fought his wolf. Transparent tubes ran from his veins into a massive processor, draining a glowing blue fluid into a silver vial held by Don Silvio. "Stop!" Sienna screamed, the air in the room beginning to vibrate with the force of her bond to the great white wolf. Silvio turned, a scalpel in his hand and a look of scientific greed in his eyes. He didn't look like a council elder, he looked like a butcher ready to carve a soul. "You're a persistent specimen, Sienna," Silvio said, his voice amplified by the sterile acoustics of the lab. He pressed the blade against Riccardo's throat. "One more step, and I'll ensure the great white wolf dies as a human stray." The world was a haze of chemical fog and the rhythmic, sickening thrum of the extraction machine. Riccardo drifted in a fugue state, his mind suspended between the paralyzing weight of the sedatives and the primal screaming of the great white wolf trapped beneath his skin. Through the reinforced glass of his cage, he could see his mother, the queen, her face gaunt and tear-streaked as she pleaded with Randall Goldfield. "You said this would cure the madness, Randall," the queen's voice echoed, thin and desperate. "You said it was medical." "It is a correction, Your Majesty," Randall replied, his voice like grinding gravel. "But your son is not a patient. He is a resource." Don Silvio adjusted a dial on the processor, his eyes gleaming with a twisted, scientific obsession. "The madness was always a misnomer, Riccardo," Silvio whispered, leaning close to the glass. "You weren't falling apart. You were resisting. Your father and Randall began the suppression when you were a child, small doses of silver and mercury to keep the great white from waking. We didn't want a king, we wanted a battery." Riccardo tried to snarl, but his vocal cords were leaden. He realized the grand lie, then. The generational curse was a fabrication, a cage built of shadows and science to ensure the Goldfields controlled the throne. Suddenly, a jolt of electricity shot through his spine, not from the machine, but from the mate bond. It was a grounding wire, cutting through the chemical fog. "Sienna." The lab doors exploded inward. Amidst the smoke and the shouting of rebels, Riccardo saw her, not the trembling maid he had bought at the auction, but a figure of iridescent white light. "Stop." Sienna's voice vibrated through his very marrow. In the chaos, Contessa Goldfield lunged toward the main console. Her face was a mask of humiliated fury. "If I cannot have the king," she shrieked, reaching for a heavy lead pipe, "then no one will have the power." She swung with all her might, smashing the silver vial that held the distilled essence of Sienna's strength. "No!" Silvio screamed, reaching for the shattered glass as the glowing blue-silver fluid began to spill across the floor. Riccardo felt the shift begin, not as a fit of madness, but as a homecoming. Without the vial to contain the power, the energy was radiating through the room, seeking its source. The laboratory was no longer a room of science, it was a cathedral of chaos. The air was thick with a lunar fog, a shimmering, electric mist born from the evaporated essence of the shattered vial. The blue-silver fluid that had once been destined for Riccardo's veins now hung in the air, blinding the tactical guards whose high-tech visors were useless against the raw brilliance of the moon. Sienna pushed through the haze, her senses sharpened by the mate bond that acted as a compass amidst the whiteout conditions. She reached the surgical table and felt a snarl rip through her chest. Riccardo lay there, pale and shivering, the transparent tubes still siphoning his life into the machine. With a cry of primal rage, Sienna gripped the extraction tubes. The moment her skin touched the plastic, a backflow of energy slammed into her. She didn't just feel the power, she felt his memories, the sting of silver needles in his nursery, the grand lie, whispered by Randall Goldfield, and the decades of madness that were nothing more than a cage built by the people he was supposed to trust. "You are not property," she screamed, ripping the needles from his arms with her bare hands. "Sienna, look out!" Maya's voice cut through the thrum of the collapsing machines. From the periphery of the fog, Contessa Goldfield lunged. Her regal silks were torn, and her face was twisted into a mask of lethal fire. She gripped a silver-tipped dagger, her eyes fixed on Sienna's throat with the intent to discard the specimen once and for all. Sienna was too slow, her body heavy with the weight of the twins and the surge of lunar energy. She braced for the impact, but it never came. Maya threw herself between them. The sound of the blade finding its mark was sickeningly quiet. Maya gasped, her body jerking as the silver steel claimed its price. The rebels let out a collective roar of grief, swarming the remaining Goldfield security like a tide. "Maya!" Sienna caught the girl as she collapsed, the silver light in the room turning from a soft shimmer to a blinding, iridescent white that mirrored the eyes of the great white wolf. You are the moon, Sienna," Maya whispered, her breath hitching. "Lead them." The grief was a catalyst. Sienna stood up, and the floor beneath her feet cracked. She turned her gaze toward Don Silvio, who was frantically clutching a hard drive, trying to flee toward the sedan. "You spent your life stealing power, Silvio," Sienna hissed, her voice echoing with a frequency that shattered the remaining glass in the lab. "Now you will know what it's like to have none." She threw her palms forward. A wave of lunar pressure struck the scientist, but it didn't break his bones. Instead, it muted him. Silvio collapsed, his eyes wide and hollow. He clawed at his chest, screaming as he realized the wolf within him had been silenced forever. He was now a human stray in the very kingdom he had sought to harvest. "The ceiling is coming down," a rebel shouted. The uncontrolled energy was rattling the structural pillars of the sublevel. Sienna turned to grab the unconscious Riccardo, but a shadow blocked her path. The fog parted to reveal a face she hadn't seen since her banishment from the Moonwealth. Alpha Lorenzo stepped over the rubble, his eyes glowing a predatory red. He didn't look at the dying machines or the fallen guards. He looked only at Sienna. "You've been a lot of trouble for a laundry maid," he growled, his hand reaching out to grab her by the hair, pulling her head back until her neck was exposed. "But you're carrying my heirs, and I'm here to take back what's mine." He pressed a cold Alpha's blade against her throat, the steel biting into her skin. The laboratory was no longer a sanctuary of science, it was a cathedral of chaos. The air was thick with a lunar fog, a shimmering, electric mist born from the evaporated essence of the shattered vial. The blue-silver fluid that had once been destined for Riccardo's veins now hung in the air as a fine vapor, blinding the tactical guards whose high-tech visors were useless against the raw, iridescent brilliance of the moon. Sienna pushed through the haze, her senses sharpened by the mate bond that acted as a psychic compass amidst the whiteout conditions. She reached the surgical table and felt a snarl rip through her chest. Riccardo lay there, pale and shivering, the transparent tubes still siphoning his life into the massive processor. With a cry of primal rage, Sienna gripped the extraction tubes. The moment her skin touched the synthetic material, a backflow of energy slammed into her. She didn't just feel the power, she felt his memories, the sting of silver needles in his nursery, the grand lie, whispered by Randall Goldfield to hide the suppression of his wolf, and the decades of madness that were nothing more than a cage built by the people he was supposed to trust. "You are not property," she screamed, ripping the needles from his arms with her bare hands. "Sienna, look out!" Maya's voice cut through the mechanical thrum of the collapsing machines. From the periphery of the fog, Contessa Goldfield lunged. Her regal silks were torn, and her face was twisted into a mask of lethal fire. She gripped a silver-tipped dagger, her eyes fixed on Sienna's throat with the intent to discard the specimen and her unborn children once and for all. Sienna was too slow, her body heavy with the weight of the twins and the sudden surge of lunar energy. She braced for the impact, but it never came. Maya threw herself between them. The sound of the blade finding its mark was sickeningly quiet. Maya gasped, her body jerking as the silver steel claimed its price. The rebels let out a collective roar of grief, swarming the remaining Goldfield security like a relentless tide. "Maya!" Sienna caught the girl as she collapsed, the silver light in the room turning from a soft shimmer to a blinding, iridescent white that mirrored the eyes of the great white wolf. You're the moon, Sienna," Maya whispered, her breath hitching as she pressed a small bottle of medicine into Sienna's palm. "Lead them." The grief was a final catalyst. Sienna stood up, and the stone floor beneath her feet cracked. She turned her gaze toward Don Silvio, who was frantically clutching a hard drive and a silver briefcase, trying to flee toward the exit. "You spent your life stealing power, Silvio," Sienna hissed, her voice echoing with a frequency that shattered the remaining glass in the lab. "Now you will know what it's like to have none." She threw her palms forward. A wave of lunar pressure struck the scientist, but it didn't break his bones. Instead, it muted him. Silvio collapsed, his eyes wide and hollow. He clawed at his chest, screaming as he realized the wolf within him had been silenced forever. He was now a human stray in the very kingdom he had sought to harvest. "The ceiling is coming down," a rebel shouted. The uncontrolled energy was rattling the structural pillars of the sublevel. Sienna turned to grab the unconscious Riccardo, but a shadow blocked her path. The fog parted to reveal a face she hadn't seen since her banishment from the Moonwealth Pack. Alpha Lorenzo stepped over the rubble, his eyes glowing a predatory red. He didn't look at the dying machines or the fallen guards. He looked only at Sienna and the belly she clutched. "You've been a lot of trouble for a laundry maid," he growled, his hand reaching out to grab her by the hair, pulling her head back until her neck was exposed. "But you're carrying my heirs, and I'm here to take back what's mine." He pressed a cold Alpha's blade against her throat, the steel biting into her skin. The heat of the burning palace sublevels pressed in on Lorenzo like a physical weight, but the former Alpha felt only the cold, sharp hunger of the hunt. He tightened his grip on Sienna's hair, forcing her head back until she was looking up at the collapsing stone ceiling. The sovereign girl he had once thrown into the mud now radiated a light that burned his retinas, but he ignored the sting. In his twisted mind, she was still just property, a stray who had dared to steal a future that belonged to him. "You've been a lot of trouble for a laundry maid, Sienna," Lorenzo growled, his voice vibrating with a cruel, alpha authority. He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear, and revealed the true depth of his betrayal. He hadn't tracked her for love or even the pride of a mate. He had made a deal with the Goldfields. In exchange for the Moon Wolf and her heirs, Sebastian Goldfield had promised to grant the Moonwealth Pack total autonomy and the technology to create an army of synthetic enforcers. Suddenly, a jagged, agonizing contraction ripped through Sienna's body. She gasped, her knees buckling, but Lorenzo held her upright by her hair, his blade never leaving her throat. The twins weren't just moving now. They were pulsing with a rhythmic, silver energy that vibrated against Lorenzo's own chest, a power that made his wolf whimper even as his human ego surged. "You are carrying something that belongs to the Moonwealth," Lorenzo spat, his eyes glowing a predatory red. "The loss as a rejected mate's firstborn belongs to the alpha of her origin. You are coming back to the pits, and once those brats are born, we will see how much of that moon wolf fire is left in you." From the edge of the firelight, Jackson appeared, a calculating smile playing on his lips. For a heartbeat, Sienna's eyes pleaded with him, but Jackson merely watched the laboring girl as if she were a piece of art in a gallery. "The specimen is useless if she dies in the dirt, Lorenzo," Jackson warned, his tone dry and detached. Lorenzo ignored him. He was obsessed with the alpha law, blinded by the hubris that had led him to reject her in the first place. Behind them, the surgical table where Riccardo had been drained was now a heap of twisted, electrified metal. A low, ground-shaking growl erupted from the debris. Riccardo hadn't just shifted, he had evolved. The great white wolf emerged from the smoke, 7 feet of silver fur and muscle, its iridescent white eyes locked onto Lorenzo's hand. The great white didn't bark or snarl, it moved with a lethal, silent grace that made the burning laboratory feel like a frozen tomb. "Riccardo, stop!" Sienna screamed through the pain, her voice cracking as another contraction hit. "If you kill him, the council will execute you." Lorenzo laughed, raising his blade to finish the stray and take the children by force. He didn't see the silver light from the council hall flowing into Sienna's hands. He didn't notice that her impending labor was acting as a beacon, pulling every ounce of lunar energy from the room into her skin. As his steel touched her neck, Sienna's eyes turned a solid, terrifying silver. She reached up, her fingers grazing Lorenzo's wrist. "You threw me in the mud, Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice sounding like the choir of 1,000 wolves. "Now you will become part of it." The silver light exploded. Lorenzo didn't even have time to scream as the lunar energy turned his very blood to fire. He fell back, his alpha authority shattered by the mother of the sovereign moon. Sienna collapsed into Riccardo's silver fur, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "The extraction, it has to end tonight," she whispered as the first of the heirs began to arrive. The great laboratory, once a temple of cold science and predatory greed, had become a funeral pyre. Ash rained down through the fractured ceiling like gray snow, and the air hummed with the dying static of the extraction machines. Riccardo, standing in his massive great white wolf form, was a silver bastion of fur and muscle over Sienna, his iridescent white eyes reflecting the flickering orange of the flames and the dawn of a new era. The labor reached its crescendo as the palace above groaned, its foundations shattered by the uncontrolled lunar energy Sienna had unleashed. She did not cry out in pain. Instead, she hummed a low, ancient melody, a song of the moon wolf that resonated through the very stones of the sovereign kingdom. The first twin arrived with a coat of pure silver fur, and the second followed moments later, a snowy white that perfectly mirrored Riccardo's legendary form. "The extraction ends tonight," Sienna whispered, her voice weak but carrying the weight of an empress as she cradled the two small, breathing miracles. From the flickering shadows of the wreckage, Jackson stepped forward. He held the grand ledger of the kingdom's debts and a single, remaining vial of blue-silver fluid. He looked at the newborns not with the love of an uncle, but with the calculating gaze of a man who saw variables in a new equation for power. "The kingdom is bankrupt, Riccardo," Jackson stated, his tone dry and devoid of the madness that had once plagued his brother. "The gold fields are dead, and the people are hungry. Give me the children. I will use the science Sebastian left behind to ensure the sovereign moon survives the winter." Riccardo shifted back to his human form, naked and shivering in the cold mountain air that poured through the ruins, yet he stood with a dignity no crown could provide. He stepped between his brother and his family, his eyes clear and devoid of the generational curse that had suppressed him for decades. "A kingdom built on the blood of its own children is already dead," Jackson, Riccardo said, his voice a steady, ground-shaking rumble. "Leave now. Find a world where your shadows cannot reach the light. If you touch my family, I will show you why the legends feared the Great White." Jackson lingered for a heartbeat, his eyes darting to the iridescent glow of the twins, before he vanished back into the tunnels. The Queen Mother entered the ruins moments later, her regal robe scorched and her face etched with the ruin of her choices. Seeing the silver light radiating from the infants, she realized the madness she had spent a lifetime trying to cure through science was the very salvation of their bloodline. She took the heavy gold crown from her head and placed it on the floor at Sienna's feet. "I traded my son for a throne," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I ask only for the mercy of a grandmother." Sienna sat up, the silver light in her eyes softening as she looked at the scars on her wrists, The marks were the shackles of her stepmother, and the auction blocks had once been. They were no longer signs of her slavery. They were the history of her ascent. She was no longer the rejected stray of the moon wealth or the inanimate object of the Goldfield Labs. She looked out through the jagged hole in the palace wall as the first rays of the sun hit the mountain crags. The Moonwealth rebels and the palace servants stood together in the courtyard, waiting for their new dawn. "We are no longer property," Sienna whispered, the twins quiet against her chest. "We are the moon."